My great-grandfather's World War I letter saved me 100 years later. Here's how. I'm a bartender. That's the first thing you need to know about me. Not because it's glamorous or interesting, but because it explains why I was driving a 12-year-old Honda Civic with a cracked windshield and couldn't afford to miss even one shift. I'm 32 years old, and I live paycheck to paycheck in a studio apartment that smells like the Indian restaurant downstairs. That's my life. Was my life before everything changed. My grandmother Eleanor died 3 weeks ago. I'm not going to pretend we had some magical Hollywood relationship where she baked cookies every Sunday and told me heartwarming stories about the old days. But she was the only person in my family who actually gave a damn about me. The only one who didn't make me feel like I was taking up space just by existing. Let me back up. I need to explain something about my father and why I hadn't lived with him in 4 years. 4 years ago, my dad married Linda. She was 48, looked 35 if you didn't look too close, and had this way of smiling that never reached her eyes. The kind of woman who always smelled like expensive perfume and spoke in this calm, rational voice that made you feel crazy for disagreeing with her. She moved into Dad's house 3 months after they got married, and I could feel the temperature drop the moment she crossed the threshold. It started with little comments. Observations, she called them, about how I left dishes in the sink sometimes, about how grown men, my age, usually had their own places, about how she and Dad were starting a new chapter and needed space to build their life together. Dad never said anything. He'd just look at his plate during dinner, or suddenly remember he needed to check something in the garage. Linda never raised her voice. Never had to. She had this talent for making suggestions that weren't really suggestions, for asking questions that weren't really questions. 6 months after she moved in, she sat me down at the kitchen table. Dad was at work. She made coffee, which I didn't drink. She told me she thought it would be healthier for everyone if I found my own place, that I was 28 and it was time, that she'd even help me look at apartments, that this was about me growing up, not about her wanting me gone. I moved out 2 weeks later. Dad helped me carry boxes. Didn't say much. At the door of my new studio apartment, he'd squeezed my shoulder and told me this was good for me, that I needed to stand on my own 2 feet. I remember nodding and agreeing, because what else was I supposed to do? Tell him his new wife had kicked me out of my childhood home? Make him choose between us? I already knew who he'd choose. After that, I saw him maybe 3 times a year. Thanksgiving if Linda was in a good mood. Christmas if they weren't traveling. He'd call sometimes, but the conversations felt rehearsed, like he was reading from a script Linda had approved. Grandma Eleanor's house became my real home after that. Not literally, I didn't live there, but it was the only place where I could show up unannounced and someone would actually be happy to see me. She was my dad's mother, and she never said much about Linda, but I could tell she saw right through her. Grandma had this way of pursing her lips whenever Linda's name came up, just for a second. Then she'd change the subject and ask if I wanted tea. The house was a small 2-bedroom place in the suburbs, nothing special. Faded yellow siding, a porch that creaked, a garden Grandma had given up on after Grandpa died. But it smelled like old books and lavender, and there was always sun coming to the kitchen windows in the afternoon. I'd visit her every couple of weeks. We'd sit in her kitchen, and she'd tell me stories about my grandfather, about growing up during the war, about her father who died in France in 1918. She had this old wooden box in her bedroom closet, full of letters and photographs and things she'd saved. Sometimes she'd show me pieces of it, yellow paper that felt like it might crumble if you breathed on it too hard, black and white photos of people I'd never met. She died in her sleep. The doctor said it was peaceful. I don't know if that's something they tell everyone, or if it was true, but I wanted to believe it. The funeral was small. Dad and Linda showed up late. Linda wore black Chanel and looked appropriately somber. Dad looked older than I remembered, grayer, tired. He hugged me and said he was sorry. Linda touched my arm and said Grandma had lived a good long life. I nodded and thanked them and felt absolutely nothing. After the funeral, Dad told me they'd handle the estate, that there wasn't much, that the house would need to be sold to cover the remaining mortgage and Grandma's final expenses. He said this like he was talking about selling a car, like it was just paperwork and phone calls. I asked if I could have some of Grandma's things. Her photos, maybe, some of her books. Dad said, of course. Linda said we'd need to sort through everything carefully, make sure nothing valuable got thrown away by accident. She said this while looking at her phone. 3 days after the funeral, I got a text from Linda. It said I needed to come by Grandma's house before 6 that evening to collect any personal items I wanted, that they were clearing out the house tomorrow, and anything left behind would be disposed of, that this was my only chance. I read that text 4 times. Dispose of, like Grandma's entire life was garbage that needed to be hauled away. I called Dad. It went to voicemail. I called again an hour later. Voicemail again. I left work early, told my boss I had a family emergency. He wasn't happy about it. We were short-staffed. But I didn't care. I drove across town with this sick feeling in my stomach, like something was ending and I couldn't stop it. When I pulled up to Grandma's house, there was a moving truck in the driveway. Not a small one either. One of those big commercial trucks you rent when you're moving entire households. The back was already half full of furniture. Grandma's couch, her dining table, her bedroom dresser. Linda was standing in the driveway, directing 2 guys in gray work uniforms. She was wearing yoga pants and a designer jacket, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She saw me get out of my car and gave me this tight smile. She told me I was cutting it close, that they needed to finish loading the truck before it got dark, that most of the valuable furniture was already claimed, but I was welcome to look through what was left. Valuable furniture. My grandmother's house. Dad was inside. I found him in the kitchen, taping up boxes. He looked up when I came in, and for just a second, I saw something in his face. Guilt, maybe, or exhaustion. But then Linda called his name from outside, and the expression vanished. He told me to grab whatever I wanted. That I should hurry, though, because the guys were on the clock. I walked through the house in a daze. It was already empty. Not just empty, hollow. Like someone had scooped out everything that made it Grandma's house and left behind just walls and floors. The furniture was gone. The pictures were gone. Even the curtains were gone. In the bedroom, I found her closet door open. Most of it had been cleaned out, but on the floor in the back, I saw it. The wooden box. It was smaller than I remembered. Old dark wood, scratched and worn. The kind of thing you'd see at an estate sale and walk right past. I picked it up, and the lid was loose, not quite closed all the way. Inside I could see the edges of envelopes, old photographs, yellowed paper. I carried it out to the living room, holding it carefully. Linda was coming back inside, checking something on her phone. She looked up and saw the box. She asked what that was. I told her it was Grandma's, letters and photos, that I want to keep it. She looked at the box like I was holding a bag of garbage. She said that it was just old papers, that it was probably full of dust and mold, that I didn't really want to keep junk like that around. I told her it wasn't junk, that these were Grandma's memories. Linda smiled, that cold smile that never touched her eyes. She said that memories were nice, but grown adults didn't need to hoard every scrap of paper their relatives left behind. That I was being sentimental, that she and Dad were doing me a favor by clearing all this out, so I didn't have to deal with it. She reached for the box. I pulled it back. For just a second, something flickered in her face. Annoyance. Real annoyance, not the calm mask she usually wore. She told me that everything in this house was part of the estate, that technically I couldn't just take things without permission. Technically. That's when Dad came outside. Linda turned to him immediately and said I was being difficult, that I was trying to take estate property without authorization, that she was just trying to keep things organized and fair. Dad looked at me, looked at the box in my hands, looked at Linda. I waited for him to say something, to tell her to back off, to tell her this wasn't about estate property. This was about his mother's personal belongings. His son wanted to keep a box of letters. He didn't. Instead, he asked me what was in the box. I told him. Letters, photos, things Grandma had saved from her father, from the war. Linda made this dismissive sound in her throat. She said that ratty old paper wasn't worth keeping, that it was probably gathering dust for 50 years, that we were trying to prepare the house for sale and didn't have time to sort through every piece of trash. Trash. She called it trash. My hands were shaking. I told her these weren't trash. These were letters from my great-grandfather, from World War I. These were important. Linda crossed her arms. She said that if they were so important, why had they been rotting in a closet? That clearly nobody had cared about them for decades. That I was being emotional and irrational. She looked at Dad, told him they needed to get back on schedule, that the movers were waiting. And Dad, my father, just nodded. He looked at me and said I should take the box if I wanted it, but that I needed to take it now and leave because they had work to do. Linda wasn't done, though. She walked over to the moving truck, and I thought she was going to talk to the workers. Instead, she came back with a large garbage bag. She told me that if I was going to take that moldy box, I should at least put it in something so I didn't get my car dirty. She held out the bag. I didn't take it. She said I was being childish, that she was trying to help, that this house needed to be emptied and cleaned, and I was standing there wasting everyone's time over a box of yellowed paper that nobody had looked at in decades. I could feel my face getting hot. I told her this wasn't about the house. This was about my grandmother, about respect. Linda laughed, not a mean laugh, worse, a patient laugh, like I was a child throwing a tantrum, and she was the reasonable adult in the room. She said that respect didn't mean hoarding garbage. That real respect meant letting go. That Grandma would want us to move forward, not cling to the past. She reached for the box again. I stepped back, and then she just took it. She grabbed the box right out of my hands before I could react. She walked toward the garbage cans at the side of the house, the big commercial dumpsters the moving company had brought. I followed her. I was saying something, I don't even remember what, asking her to stop, telling her she had no right. She didn't stop. She stood at the edge of the driveway, holding the box out over the garbage cans. She told me I had two choices: take the box and leave now, or stand there arguing while she threw the whole thing away. She said this calmly, rationally, like she was offering me a business proposal. I should have just grabbed it, should have taken it and walked away. But I was frozen. I couldn't believe this was actually happening, that she would actually throw away my grandmother's belongings because I'd argued with her. She waited 5 seconds, maybe less. Then she turned the box upside down. Everything fell out. Letters scattered across the gravel driveway. Photographs landed face down in the dirt. Envelopes that had been carefully preserved for a century hit the ground and split open. I saw yellowed paper, old stamps, handwritten addresses in ink that had faded to brown. Linda dropped the empty box on top of the pile. She told me there, now I could take whatever trash I wanted, that she was done wasting time on this. She walked back toward the house. I dropped to my knees and started grabbing things. My hands were shaking, so hard I could barely hold the papers. Some of the envelopes were torn. Photographs were crumpled. There was gravel stuck to everything. Dad came over. He stood above me while I knelt there in the driveway, scrambling to collect pieces of my grandmother's life from the dirt. He told me to just take what I could carry and go. That Linda was right. They needed to finish clearing the house. That I was making this harder than it needed to be. I looked up at him. I wanted to ask him how he could let this happen, how he could stand there and watch his wife throw his mother's belongings in the garbage, how he could choose this woman over his own son, over his own mother's memory. But I didn't ask, because I already knew the answer. I'd known for 4 years. I found a cardboard box in my car, one I'd been using for groceries. Then I saw the wooden box, lying on its side near the garbage cans. The lid was cracked, one corner was dented, but it was still intact. I grabbed it, shook out the pieces of gravel that had gotten inside, started gathering everything into it, the letters, the photos, some loose stamps that had fallen out of the envelopes. My hands were filthy. There was dirt under my fingernails. Some of the papers were ripped, and I tried to smooth them out, but they just tore more. Across the street, I saw Mrs. Green standing on her porch. She was Grandma's neighbor, had lived there for 30 years. Her granddaughter Emily was with her, maybe 16 or 17. Emily was holding her phone up, pointed in our direction. I wondered if she was filming, if she'd captured this whole humiliating scene. Me on my knees in a driveway, collecting trash while my father and his wife cleared out my grandmother's house like they were flipping a property on HGTV. The shame was worse than the anger. I loaded the wooden box into my passenger seat. It was heavier than I remembered, even though half the contents were probably still scattered in that driveway. Some of the letters had mud on them. I'd gotten most of them. I thought, maybe not all. It was getting dark, and I couldn't see clearly anymore. Linda came back outside as I was getting in my car. She called out to me, told me to make sure I closed my car door carefully, that some of those papers looked fragile and I wouldn't want them blowing away. She said this pleasantly. Helpfully, I got in my car and closed the door. I didn't look at her, didn't look at Dad, just started the engine and backed out of the driveway, careful not to run over any letters I might have missed. As I drove away, I could see them in my rearview mirror. Dad and Linda, standing in front of my grandmother's house. The moving truck was almost fully loaded. They'd have the place emptied by tonight, probably listed for sale by next week, within a month. Some new family would move in and never know that Eleanor had lived there, that she'd raised a son there, that she kept her father's letters in a wooden box in her closet for almost 80 years. I drove back to my apartment with the windows down, even though it was cold. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, dirt under my nails, old ink stains on my fingers from handling the damaged letters. The wooden box sat on the passenger seat next to me, rattling slightly every time I hit a pothole. Everything that was left of Grandma's memories crammed back into that crack box. When I pulled into my parking spot, I just sat there for a minute, the engine ticking as it cooled down, the smell of the Indian restaurant downstairs seeping through the vents. I called Sarah. She answered on the second ring, and I could hear the TV in the background at her place. She asked if I was okay, said I sounded weird. I told her I needed to see her, that something happened at Grandma's house, that I couldn't explain it over the phone, but I needed someone to tell me I wasn't losing my mind. She said she'd be over in 20 minutes. I carried the wooden box upstairs carefully, like I was carrying something fragile and precious, which I guess I was. Inside my studio apartment, I set it on my kitchen counter and just stared at it. This was all I had left of Grandma. A cracked wooden box full of damaged letters and torn photographs that Linda had called trash, that Dad had let her dump in the driveway while he stood there and did nothing. I wanted to open it, to see what was actually in there, what had been worth keeping for 80 years. But my hands were still shaking, and I was afraid I'd damaged something else. Everything felt fragile. Everything felt like it might fall apart if I touched it wrong. So I waited for Sarah, because I needed someone else to see this, to witness that this had actually happened, that I wasn't making it up or being dramatic. That what happened today mattered. Sarah showed up with a bottle of wine. Cheap stuff, the kind that comes with a screw-top cap. But I didn't care. She took one look at me standing in my doorway with dirt still under my fingernails and pulled me into a hug without asking questions. We sat on my broken couch with the wooden box between us on the coffee table. I told her everything. About Linda throwing Grandma's things in the driveway. About Dad standing there doing nothing. About me on my knees in the gravel, trying to save letters that nobody else thought were worth keeping. Sarah didn't say much while I talked, just listened and refilled my wine when the glass got empty. When I finished, she reached over and squeezed my hand, told me Linda was a piece of work, and that my dad should be ashamed of himself. It felt good to hear someone say it out loud. We opened the box carefully. The lid was cracked from where Linda had thrown it, but it still worked. Inside, everything was jumbled together. Letters mixed with photographs, loose stamps that had fallen out of torn envelopes. Some papers were stained with mud from the driveway. Others had creases where they'd been stepped on. Sarah started pulling things out gently, laying them on the coffee table. Old photographs first, black and white images of people I'd never met. Young men in military uniforms. Women in long dresses standing in front of houses I didn't recognize. The photos had that soft, slightly blurry quality that came from cameras a century ago. Then the letters, dozens of them, maybe 50 or more, all addressed in the same careful handwriting to Mrs. Eleanor Webb, various addresses in Pennsylvania. The return address was always the same. Private James Webb, followed by military unit numbers I didn't understand. My great-grandfather, Grandma's father, the man who died in France before she turned 2 years old. Sarah asked if I wanted to read some of them. I wasn't sure at first. It felt invasive somehow, like reading someone's diary. But then I remembered that Grandma had kept these letters for her entire life. She'd shown them to me when I was younger. She wanted someone to remember. So I opened one. The paper was thin, almost translucent. The ink had faded to a brownish color. The handwriting was neat but small, like he'd been trying to fit as much as possible onto each page. The letter was dated March 1918. He wrote about the cold, about how the trenches were full of mud, and how he missed sleeping in a real bed, about how he hoped his wife and daughter were staying warm, that he worried about them having enough coal for the winter. It was ordinary, mundane even, but there was something about reading these words from a man who'd been dead for over 100 years, knowing he'd written them in a war zone, while worrying about heating bills back home. Sarah was looking through the envelopes. She pulled one out and held it up to the light, asked me why there were stamps inside the letters instead of on them. I looked. She was right. Inside several of the envelopes, loose stamps, some singles, some in pairs, all unused. The adhesive on the back was still there, just dried out and yellow. And that's when I remembered what Grandma had told me. I explained it to Sarah, told her that my great-grandfather, this guy sitting in French trenches getting shot, had been worried about his wife spending money on stamps to write back to him. So in every letter he sent home, he'd include unused stamps. That way she could write back without having to pay for postage. Sarah's eyes got watery. She said that was the most romantic thing she'd ever heard. I kept reading letters, moving chronologically through 1917 and into 1918. They got shorter as time went on, less about day-to-day life, more just checking in, telling his wife he loved her, asking about their daughter, saying he hoped to be home soon. Then I found the last one. The envelope was dated May 1918. The paper felt even more fragile than the others, like it might dissolve if I held it too tight. Inside, the letter was only half a page. The handwriting was Messier, rushed maybe, or tired. He wrote that things were getting bad, that he didn't know when he'd be able to write again, that he wanted his wife to know he loved her and their daughter more than anything, that they should use the money from his military pay to take care of themselves, that he wished he could have given them more. Then at the bottom, a postscript. He wrote that he was including some new stamps with airplanes on them, that the guys at the field post office had been laughing because the printer must have been drunk or something, because the airplane was printed upside down, that he knew they probably weren't good for much, but they were all he had, so he was sending them anyway. Sarah asked to see the envelope. I handed it to her carefully. She opened the flap and pulled out a small block of stamps, for stamps attached together in a square. Each one showed an airplane in the center, printed in blue ink with a red border, and the airplane was upside down. She held them up to the light, said it was weird that someone would print stamps wrong like that, asked if I thought they were worth anything. I didn't know. Probably not. It was just a printing error. They were over 100 years old, though. Maybe a collector would want them as a curiosity. Sarah got out her phone, started searching, typed in something like old stamps airplane upside down. The first result that came up was from Wikipedia, the inverted Jenny. Sarah started reading out loud. Her voice got quieter as she went, like she couldn't believe what she was reading. She said it was one of the most famous stamp errors in history, that in 1918, the U.S. Post Office had printed a sheet of stamps with a biplane called the Curtiss JN-4, nicknamed the Jenny. That one sheet of 100 stamps had been printed with the airplane upside down. That someone bought that sheet before the post office could catch the error and destroy it. That there were only 100 of these stamps in existence. That they'd become the holy grail of stamp collecting. She looked up at me, asked if I thought these could be real. I looked at the stamps in her hand. for little pieces of paper with a blue airplane and a red border. They looked old enough. The paper was yellowed. The perforation on the edges was rough, like it had been done by hand. But this was crazy. These were stamps my great-grandfather had included in a letter because he felt bad about not having better ones. He literally apologized for sending stamps with a printing error. Sarah kept reading. Said that a single inverted Jenny stamp could sell for over $1 million. That a block of 4, a plate block with the margin attached showing the position number, could go for 4 or 5 million. She turned the stamps over carefully. On the margin, tiny numbers. Position markers from the original sheet. We both just stared at them. I told her this couldn't be real. That things like this didn't happen to people like us. That we were sitting in my studio apartment that smelled like Indian food, drinking $7 wine, and she was trying to tell me I was holding $5 million worth of stamps. Sarah said we needed to find out for sure, that we needed an expert. I barely slept that night. Sarah stayed over, but I just lay there staring at the ceiling. The wooden box was on my kitchen counter. Inside it, for stamps that were either worthless or worth more money than I'd make in 10 lifetimes. In the morning, I called in sick to work. My boss was pissed. I didn't care. Sarah and I spent 3 hours on the phone, calling auction houses and stamp dealers. Most of them said they'd need to see the stamps in person. Several of them laughed when I described what I had. Said people tried to scam them with fake inverted Jennies all the time. Finally, we got through to someone at Sotheby's in New York, a specialist in rare stamps. He said that if what I was describing was authentic, we should bring it in immediately, that they'd need to verify it, but if it was real, they'd want to handle the auction. We drove to New York the next day. 6 hours in my Honda Civic, with a cracked windshield. The stamps were in the wooden box, wrapped in the original envelope, sitting in my lap the entire time. I was terrified someone would rear-end us, or that we'd get carjacked, or that the car would catch fire. Sarah kept telling me to breathe. The Sotheby's building in Manhattan looked like a place I had no business being in. All glass and marble and security guards in suits. We must have looked ridiculous. Me in my jeans and work boots, Sarah in her Target jacket, carrying an old wooden box like it was a bomb. The stamp specialist was a man in his 60s named Dr. Howard Chun. He had reading glasses on a chain and the kind of calm, measured way of speaking that made me think he dealt with nervous people bringing in family heirlooms every day. He led us to a back room, put on white gloves, asked me to show him what I had. I opened the wooden box, pulled out the envelope, handed it to him. Dr. Chun opened it carefully, pulled out the block of 4 stamps, held them up to the light. Then he sat down. He didn't say anything for a long time, just looked at the stamps through a magnifying glass, checking the perforation, the ink, the paper. He pulled out this weird UV light thing and held the stamps under it, took photographs, made notes on a pad. Sarah was gripping my hand, so hard I lost feeling in my fingers. Finally, Dr. Chun looked up at us. He asked where I'd gotten these. I told him about my grandmother, about the letters from World War I, about Linda throwing the box in the driveway. Dr. Chun just nodded, like he'd heard stranger stories. He said that based on his preliminary examination, these appeared to be authentic, that he'd need to do more detailed testing. But the paper stock was correct, the ink composition matched period samples, and the perforation pattern was consistent with the original sheet. He said that if they were real, and he was 95% certain they were, this was a plate block of inverted Jennies, that there were fewer than 10 of these in private hands, that the last one to sell at auction had gone for $4.9 million. I thought I was going to throw up. Sarah actually did cry, just sat there in a chair in this fancy auction house back room, crying while Dr. Chun explained authentication procedures and insurance requirements and auction timelines. He said it would take 3 months to prepare for auction, that they'd need to verify provenance, run additional tests, prepare marketing materials, that they'd photograph the stamps for the catalog, that they'd want to reach out to major collectors beforehand to gauge interest. 3 months. 3 months of knowing I had something worth millions of dollars sitting in a safe deposit box. 3 months of wondering if someone would steal it, if there would be a fire, If I'd wake up and find out this was all some elaborate dream. Sarah and I stayed in New York that night, got a cheap hotel near Penn Station, ordered Chinese food, and ate it in bed while watching cable TV neither of us was really paying attention to. She asked me what I was going to do with the money, if it was real, if everything worked out. I didn't have an answer. I couldn't think about money. Couldn't think about anything except the fact that my great-grandfather, who died in a trench in France worrying about heating bills, had accidentally sent home stamps worth more than most people's houses. The next 3 months were the longest of my life. I quit my job at the bar. Had to. I couldn't focus. Kept screwing up orders and giving people wrong change because my brain was somewhere else entirely. My boss said he understood, which was nice of him, even though he clearly didn't understand at all. The stamps were in a safe deposit box at a bank in Manhattan. Sotheby's had arranged it. They'd insured them for $5 million. $5 million. I had a piece of paper from an insurance company saying they'd pay $5 million if anything happened to 4 stamps that were sitting in a box at a bank. I drove to New York once a week, just to check, just to make sure they were still there. Sarah came with me sometimes, but mostly I went alone. I'd sit in the bank vault room staring at the stamps in their protective case, try to convince myself this was real. I didn't tell my father, didn't tell anyone except Sarah. I was terrified that if word got out, someone would try to steal them, or that Linda would find some legal way to claim they were part of Grandma's estate, or that the whole thing would fall apart and I'd look like an idiot. At night, I'd lie awake doing math. For $0.9 million, minus Sotheby's commission, minus taxes, minus fees, how much would actually be left? Would it be enough to quit working? To buy a house? To never worry about money again? I felt guilty for thinking about it. This was Grandma's legacy. These were letters from a soldier who died a century ago. They weren't supposed to be about money, but they were. Whether I liked it or not, they were. Sotheby's scheduled the auction for a Thursday in October. Specialized philatelic auction, they called it, which apparently meant stamps, because everything in the auction world has to sound more important than it actually is. Sarah and I drove to New York the night before. Stayed at the same cheap hotel near Penn Station. Couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the ways this could go wrong. What if nobody bid? What if the estimate was wrong? What if there was some technical problem with the stamps that Dr. Chin had missed? The auction was at 2 in the afternoon. We got there an hour early. Sat in the back of the auction room, which looked like a small theater with padded seats and fancy lighting. There were maybe 40 people there. Collectors, dealers, people with more money than I'd see in 5 lifetimes. Dr. Chun found us before it started, told me that there was already significant interest, that he expected strong bidding, that I should be prepared for either outcome. I nodded like I understood what he was talking about. The auction started with other items. Lesser stamps, rare letters, that kind of thing. I wasn't paying attention. My leg was bouncing, so hard Sarah had to put her hand on my knee to stop it. Then they brought out the inverted Jenny plate block. The auctioneer described it. Position from the original sheet. Provenance from a World War I letter. Pristine condition. He started the bidding at $2 million. 3 people raised their paddles immediately. $2.5 million. $3 million. 3.5. It happened so fast I couldn't keep track. The auctioneer was calling out numbers, pointing at people. For million, for .2, for .5, then a longer pause, for .6. Someone in the front row, for .7, for .8. The auctioneer looked around the room, called for 4.9 million. One final paddle went up, going once, going twice. The hammer came down, sold for $4,900,000. Dr. Chun was shaking my hand. Sarah was crying. People in the room were clapping, which felt surreal, like I'd won something instead of just sold a piece of family history. For $0.9 million, minus Sotheby's 15% commission, minus capital gains tax at the federal level, plus state, minus fees and insurance, and a dozen other things I didn't understand. Dr. Chin said after everything, I'd net about $2.8 million. $2.8 million. From 4 stamps my great-grandfather had apologized for sending home because they had a printing error. The money was transferred to my bank account 2 weeks later. I watched it happen on my phone, checked my balance, and saw numbers I didn't know how to process. $2,823,472. I sat in my studio apartment that smelled like Indian food and stared at my phone for an hour. Sarah came over that night. We ordered pizza, sat on my broken couch eating cheap pizza, and drinking expensive champagne she'd bought to celebrate. She asked me again what I was going to do. I told her I didn't know, that I needed time to think, that this all felt surreal and wrong, and like it was happening to someone else. My phone rang while we were sitting there. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but Sarah told me I should. It was my father. He didn't say hello, didn't ask how I was doing, just launched right into it. He said he'd seen an article online about a record-breaking stamp auction, about an inverted Jenny plate block that had sold for nearly $5 million, about how it had been discovered in correspondence from Private James Webb, World War I soldier who died in France in 1918. James Webb, his grandfather, my great-grandfather. His voice was shaking, but not with emotion, with something else. Anger maybe, or greed, or fear what Linda would do if he didn't make this call. He said those were his mother's letters, his family's property, that the stamps had been part of the estate we were clearing out, that I'd taken them without authorization. I could hear Linda in the background. Her voice was muffled but distinct, telling him what to say, coaching him through it. Dad said they were happy for me, that this was incredible, that nobody was trying to ruin this for me, but that Linda had talked to a lawyer, and technically, since everything in Grandma's house was part of the estate that passed him as the sole heir, the stamps belonged to the estate, to him, that the money from the sale should rightfully be split, or better yet, placed in a family trust. He kept talking about technicalities, about estate law, about how we were family, and we should work this out together, without lawyers, without making things ugly. Then he said the magic words, the ones Linda had obviously fed him. He said that if I didn't want to discuss this reasonably, they'd have no choice but to file a claim, that they'd already consulted with an attorney who said they had a strong case for conversion of property, that they didn't want to sue me, but I'd left them no choice. I told him I'd think about it, that I needed to go. I hung up before he could say anything else. My phone rang again immediately. Dad calling back. I didn't answer. Another call. Unknown number. Could be their lawyer. Could be a reporter who tracked down my information from the auction house. I didn't answer that either. Sarah asked if I was okay. I told her no, that I wasn't okay, that I'd known this was coming, that of course Dad and Linda would show up now that there was money, now that the trash they'd thrown in the driveway was worth $3 million. My phone kept ringing. Dad called back twice. Then a number I didn't recognize. Then another. I turned my phone off, sat there in the dark with Sarah, wondering how long it would take before everything I just gained turned into the worst fight of my life. I told her no, that I wasn't okay, that I'd known this was coming, that of course Dad and Linda would show up now that there was money, now that the trash they'd thrown in the driveway was worth $3 million. My phone kept ringing. Dad called back twice. Then a number I didn't recognize. Then another. I turned my phone off. The next morning, I woke up to a certified letter slipped under my door. Must have been delivered by a process server while we were sleeping. The envelope was thick, official-looking, with a law firm's name embossed on the return address. Berkman and Associates. Century City, Los Angeles. Expensive lawyers. The kind Linda would hire. Inside was a legal complaint. 12 pages of dense text full of words like plaintiff and defendant and whereas and heretofore. I had to read it 3 times before I understood what it was actually saying. They were suing me for conversion of property, claiming that the stamps had been part of Grandma's estate, that as the sole heir, my father had legal ownership of all contents of the house, that I'd taken the stamps without authorization and sold them, keeping the proceeds for myself, that I'd exploited their lack of knowledge about the stamps' value. They were asking for the full auction proceeds, all $4.9 million, plus damages, plus legal fees. There was an emergency motion attached. They'd already filed for a temporary restraining order to freeze my bank accounts pending the outcome of the case. Sarah read over my shoulder, asked if they could actually do this. I didn't know. I hoped not, but the paperwork looked real enough. The legal language was terrifying in its specificity. I called a lawyer that afternoon, found one through a legal aid website who handled estate disputes. His name was Marcus Chun, no relation to Dr. Chun from Sotheby's, and he worked out of a small office in Pasadena. He agreed to meet with me on contingency, meaning he'd take percentage if we won and nothing if we lost. That should have made me feel better. It didn't. It just meant he thought there was a chance we'd actually win something. Marcus was younger than I expected, maybe 40. He wore a cheap suit and had coffee stains on his tie. His office was 2 rooms above a dry cleaner, and I could smell the chemical scent of cleaning solution through the air vents. He read through the complaint while I sat across from his desk, trying not to have a panic attack. Finally, he looked up, asked me to tell him exactly what happened. From the beginning, I told him everything. About Grandma's death, about Linda forcing me to clear out the house, about her throwing the box in the driveway and calling it trash, about me picking it up and taking it home. Marcus listened without interrupting, made notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. He said the problem was straightforward. Legally speaking, everything in Grandma's house became my father's property the moment she died. As the sole heir, he inherited the entire estate. That included the contents of the house. All of it, even things that seemed like trash. He said that unless I could prove my father had explicitly given me the box or abandoned his claim to it, their case had merit. It would come down to whether the court believed I had taken the stamps without permission, or whether my father had effectively discarded them. It was my word against theirs. I asked him what our chances were. Marcus didn't sugarcoat it. He said, maybe 50-50. That would depend on the judge, on how the story was presented, on whether we would find any evidence that my father had knowingly abandoned the property. Then he told me about the restraining order, said they'd probably get it approved within a week, that my bank accounts would be frozen until the case was resolved, that I wouldn't be able to access the auction money. I asked him how long that would take. He said 6 months, maybe a year. These things moved slowly. A year of being broke, while lawyers fought over money that was sitting in a frozen bank account. A year of Linda playing the victim on TV, while I couldn't even afford rent. Sarah was waiting outside in the car. I got in and just sat there, staring through the cracked windshield. She asked what the lawyer said. I told her we were screwed, that we might win eventually, but in the meantime, I'd be broke and probably homeless. That Linda had hired expensive lawyers who knew exactly how to drag this out. Sarah reached over and took my hand, said we'd figure it out, that I could stay with her, that we'd get through this. I wanted to believe her. Then I remembered something, a detail I'd forgotten in all the chaos and stress. Mrs. Green, the neighbor, she'd been standing on her porch that day, watching, and her granddaughter Emily had been holding her phone up. I asked Marcus about it the next morning, called him from Sarah's apartment, explained that there had been a witness, that the neighbor's granddaughter might have filmed the whole thing. Marcus got quiet for a minute. Then he asked if I was sure, if I remembered it clearly. I told him yes, that I remembered seeing Emily with her phone, that at the time I'd been embarrassed, but now it might be the only thing that could save me. Marcus said he'd look into it, that he'd try to track down the neighbor, that if there was video evidence of Linda throwing the box away and calling it trash, that could change everything. He said it would take a few days. The restraining order came through that Wednesday. I got the notification on my phone. My bank account was frozen. $2.8 million sitting there, untouchable. I couldn't even withdraw money for groceries. Sarah loaned me money for food. I felt like I was 22 again, broke and dependent on other people's generosity. Except now, I technically had millions of dollars. I just couldn't access any of it. The local news picked up the story, not the major networks, but the regional channels. They ran a segment about the stamp auction and the legal battle. Linda gave an interview. She looked perfect on camera. Makeup done professionally. Hair styled. She wore a simple black dress and spoke in that calm, measured voice I'd always hated. She said she was heartbroken, that this wasn't about money, that her husband's mother had passed away, and in the chaos of grief, a valuable family heirloom had been taken, that they'd tried to resolve this privately, but her stepson had refused to discuss it reasonably. She said she understood that young people sometimes made poor decisions, that she hoped Michael would do the right thing and return what rightfully belonged to family, that they were prepared to forgive and move forward if he'd just acknowledge his mistake. She called me Michael, like we were close, like she cared. The interviewer asked if she thought it was an honest mistake or intentional theft. Linda paused, looked down, touched her eyes like she was fighting back tears. Then she said she wanted to believe it was a misunderstanding, but that when someone refuses to return millions of dollars, it's hard to see it as anything but intentional. I watched the interview on Sarah's laptop, wanted to throw the computer across the room. Sarah had to physically stop me. She said getting angry wouldn't help, that we needed to trust Marcus, that he'd find Mrs. Green, and everything would work out. Marcus called me 2 days later, said he'd tracked down Mrs. Green, that she remembered the incident clearly, that her granddaughter Emily had filmed it because they'd been worried about calling the police, that Emily still had the video on her phone. He said Emily had agreed to testify, that she provide the video as evidence. He said this changed everything. I could have cried. Actually might have. Sarah definitely did. Marcus explained that the video would prove abandonment of property, that if Linda was clearly shown throwing the box away and calling it trash, telling me to take it, then legally I had every right to claim it, that there was no theft, no conversion, just someone taking property that had been explicitly discarded. He said we present the video in court, that Linda's lawyers would try to discredit it, but video evidence was hard to argue with. The court date was set for 6 weeks later, the longest 6 weeks of my life. I couldn't work, couldn't focus on anything, just waited in Sarah's apartment, watching the news, reading updates on legal forums, trying to understand what was happening. Linda's lawyers filed motions trying to suppress the video, claiming it was recorded without consent, that it violated privacy laws. Marcus filed counter motions, explaining that there's no expectation of privacy in a driveway, in public view, in the middle of the afternoon. The judge denied their motions. The video would be admitted. The courthouse was in downtown Los Angeles, one of those old buildings with marble floors and high ceilings that echo. Sarah came with me. Marcus met us outside, carrying a briefcase that looked like it had seen better days. He told me to stay calm, to let him do the talking, that I'd probably call to testify, but that the video would do most of the work. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than I expected, with paneling, rows of benches, a judge's bench that seemed too high, like a throne. Dad and Linda were already there, sitting at the plaintiff's table with their lawyers, 2 men in expensive suits who looked like they billed $500 an hour. Linda was wearing a conservative gray dress, pearl earrings. She looked like someone's grandmother, like a victim. Dad wouldn't look at me, just stared straight ahead. The judge came in. Everyone stood. The bailiff announced the case. Robert Mitchell versus Michael Mitchell. Estate dispute. Conversion of property. Linda's lawyer went first. He was good. I'll give him that. He painted a picture of a grieving son trying to settle his mother's estate, of a stepmother trying to help, of a grandson who'd taken advantage of chaos and confusion to steal a valuable family heirloom. He talked about the auction, about how I'd sold the stamps without informing my father, about how I'd kept all the proceeds, about how this was clearly theft dressed up as inheritance. He called it a betrayal of family trust. The whole time, I sat there trying not to react. Marcus had warned me, said they'd try to make me look greedy, to make this about money instead of what actually happened. Then it was Marcus's turn. He called Emily Green to the stand. She was 19 now, taller than I remembered. She walked to the witness stand looking nervous, but determined, swore to tell the truth. Marcus asked her to describe what she'd seen that day. Emily explained that she'd been visiting her grandmother, that they'd heard shouting from across the street, that they'd seen a woman throwing things in the driveway while a man watched. Marcus asked if she recorded what happened. Emily said yes, that she'd been concerned, that the woman was yelling and throwing things, and she'd wanted documentation in case they needed to call the police. Marcus asked if she still had the video. Emily said yes. He asked permission to play it for the court. The judge approved. They set up a screen, connected Emily's phone. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly. The video started. The quality wasn't great. Phone camera from across the street. But the audio was clear enough. You could hear everything. Linda's voice, sharp and angry, calling the box junk, saying she didn't want to see this trash in her house, threatening to burn it if I didn't take it immediately. You could see her throw the box, see the contents scatter, see me drop to my knees, try and gather everything. You could hear my father's voice, telling me to take the stuff and leave. That Linda was right about clearing out the house. The video was 90 seconds long. It felt like an hour. When it finished, the courtroom was completely silent. Linda's face was red, not crying red, angry red, like she'd been caught in a lie and knew it. Dad still wasn't looking at me. Marcus asked Emily if anyone had pressured her to provide this video, if anyone had offered her money or incentives. Emily said no, that she was just telling the truth about what happened. Linda's lawyer tried to cross-examine her, asked if she was friends with me, if we discussed this case. Emily said she'd never spoken to me, that she was doing this because it was the right thing to do. The judge asked for closing arguments. Linda's lawyer tried to salvage it, argued that even if my father had told me to take the box, he hadn't known what was inside, that this was still conversion of property because I knowingly kept something valuable that belonged to this state. Marcus stood up. He was calmer than I'd seen him. He explained the legal doctrine of abandoned property, said that when an owner explicitly declares something trash and tells someone to remove it, they're abandoning their claim. That intention matters. That the video clearly showed intentional abandonment. He said I'd taken what I was told to take, that I discovered its value later through my own research, that there was no theft, no deception, just a family member claiming property that had been thrown away. The judge didn't need much time to decide. She said the video evidence was clear, that the property in question had been explicitly designated as trash by the legal owner, that verbal instruction to remove it constituted abandonment of property rights, that once abandoned, the property became available for anyone to claim. She said Michael Mitchell had legally claimed abandoned property, that the subsequent sale of that property was entirely within his rights, that the plaintiff's case had no merit. Case dismissed. I didn't react immediately, couldn't process it, just sat there while Marcus shook my hand and Sarah hugged me from behind. Linda stood up so fast her chair fell over. She walked out of the courtroom without looking back. Her lawyers gathered their papers quickly, professionally, like this happened all the time. Dad sat there for another minute, finally looked at me. His eyes were empty, tired, maybe ashamed, but I couldn't tell. He stood up slowly and followed Linda out. Marcus told me the restraining order would be lifted within 24 hours, that I'd have access to my money again, that they couldn't appeal, the case was too clear-cut. He said congratulations, said this was the easiest case he'd had in years. Thanks to the video, I asked how much I owed him. He said 20% of the auction proceeds, as agreed, $560,000. I told him I'd transfer it as soon as my accounts were unfrozen. He said there was no rush, that he trusted me. We shook hands. He left through a side door, probably heading to another case, another client, another problem. Sarah and I walked out through the main entrance. The marble floors echoed with our footsteps. Outside, the sun was setting. The sky over downtown LA was orange and purple. Traffic noise filled the air. Normal city sounds. We got dinner at a cheap Thai place near the courthouse. Sat in a booth that was probably older than I was. Ordered pad Thai and spring rolls and celebrated with Thai iced tea instead of champagne. That night, I couldn't sleep. Kept thinking about Dad's face in the courtroom, about how he'd chosen Linda, how he let her drag his own son to court over money, how he'd sat there and watched me defend myself against theft charges, all because he was too weak to stand up to his wife. I thought about Grandma, about how she'd kept those letters for 80 years, how she'd treasured them not because they were valuable, but because they were her father's last words to her, how she'd never known what they were worth, how she just kept them because they mattered. I think she would have been happy with how things turned out, not the money, the justice. The accounts were unfrozen 2 days later. I transferred Marcus's fee immediately. Then I called Emily Green. I'd gotten her number from Marcus, called her, and asked if we could meet for coffee. She agreed, probably curious why the guy from the court case was calling. We met at a Starbucks near her college campus. She was studying engineering at UCLA, had another year left, was buried in student loans like most kids her age. I thanked her for testifying, told her she'd saved my life, literally, that without her video, I'd have lost everything. She said it was the right thing to do, that she'd been angry watching the news, seeing that woman play victim when Emily knew exactly what had happened. I asked how much she owed in student loans. Emily looked uncomfortable, said it wasn't my business. I told her I wanted to help, that I owed her more than I could repay. She told me $85,000. 2 years of grad school plus undergrad. She said it quietly like she was ashamed. I paid it off that afternoon. All of it. Called the loan servicer and paid the full balance. Sent Emily the confirmation email. She called me crying. Said she didn't know what to say. That this was too much. That she couldn't accept it. I told her she didn't have a choice. That the money was already transferred. That she'd given me back my future. So it seemed fair to give her back hers. She asked if we could stay in touch. I said yes. Sarah and I spent the next few months figuring out what to do with the money. After Marcus's fee and Emily's loans, we had about $2 million left, maybe a little more. We didn't want a mansion, didn't want fancy cars, didn't want to turn into the kind of people who forgot where they came from. We decided to open a restaurant. Sarah had always wanted to. She'd worked in food service her whole life, knew the business inside and out. We found a space in Pasadena, not far from where I'd grown up. Small place, maybe 40 seats. Good bones. Needed renovation. We spent 8 months fixing it up. Hired contractors. Picked out tables and chairs. Designed a menu. Sarah wanted it to be the kind of place where regulars felt like family, where the food was good and the prices were fair. We called it Eleanor's. Named it after Grandma. Hung her photo on the wall near the entrance. Not the wooden box, though. That was at home, in our apartment. We'd moved into a real place. 2 bedrooms. No smell of Indian food from downstairs. Our own space. The restaurant opened on a Tuesday in March. We didn't advertise much. Word of mouth. Local reviews. We were busy from day one. Sarah ran the front of house. I worked as a bartender, which is what I knew. Poured drinks. Talked to customers. Made them feel welcome. It was the first time in my life I felt like I was doing something that mattered. Not just surviving, actually building something. A year passed. The restaurant was profitable. Not wealthy profitable, but sustainable. We'd paid ourselves small salaries. Kept most of the profit in the business for improvements. We still had over $1 million in the bank. Saved. Invested conservatively. We weren't rich, but we were secure. The kind of secure where you don't worry about rent or medical bills or car repairs. The kind of secure most people dream about but never reach. My father came to the restaurant on a Thursday afternoon. Quiet time between lunch and dinner service. I was behind the bar cleaning glasses. He walked in alone. Looked older than I remembered. Thinner. His hair was completely gray now. His jacket didn't fit right, like he'd lost weight recently. He stood at the entrance for a minute, looking around. Saw Grandma's photo on the wall. Saw the name of the restaurant. Something flickered across his face. He sat at the bar. Asked if I had a minute to talk. I did. We were empty except for one couple in the corner finishing dessert. I didn't say anything. Just waited. He told me Linda left him. That after the court case, after it became clear there was no money coming, she'd file for divorce. That she'd taken half of everything in the settlement. that his legal fees from the lawsuit had eaten up most of the money from selling Grandma's house. He said he was living in a small apartment now, working part-time at a hardware store, getting by, barely. He said he was sorry, that he'd made mistakes, that he'd chosen wrong, that he hoped we could talk, maybe rebuild our relationship. Then he asked if I needed any help at the restaurant, said he could work evenings, wash dishes, whatever I needed. He was asking for a job, and probably money, though he didn't say it directly. I poured him a cup of coffee, on the house, said it in front of him on the bar, told him I appreciated him coming by, that I was glad he was doing okay, relatively speaking, that I hoped things worked out for him. He started to say something about family, about how we were still father and son, about how we should move past this. I stopped him, told him that I invest in things that I value, in people who've proven themselves, that I'd learned that from experience. I said our relationship was like the legal term from his lawsuit, abandoned property, that he'd made his choice years ago when he picked Linda over his son, that he confirmed that choice in the driveway at Grandma's house, and again in court. I told him that abandoned property doesn't come back, that once you throw something away and walk away from it, you don't get to reclaim it later just because you realize it had value. He sat there holding his coffee cup, didn't drink it, just stared down at it like he could see his life reflected in the dark liquid. I told him the coffee was free, but that was all I could offer him, that I wished him well, that I hoped he found what he was looking for. He stood up slowly, left the coffee untouched, walked to the door. At the threshold, he turned back, asked if I'd ever forgive him. I told him I already had, that forgiveness and trust were two different things, that I'd forgiven him for being weak, for choosing wrong, for letting Linda manipulate him, but that forgiveness didn't mean relationship, didn't mean I'd let him back into my life. He nodded, like he understood, like he'd expected that answer. He left. I watched him walk down the street through the restaurant window. He moved like someone who'd lost everything, shoulders slumped, head down, the kind of posture that comes from knowing you've got no one to blame but yourself. Sarah came out from the kitchen, asked if I was okay. I told her yes, that I was better than okay. That night, after we closed, we sat in the empty restaurant, just us and the dim lights and the smell of coffee and bread. I thought about Grandma, about her father, my great-grandfather, writing letters from a trench in France, worrying about heating bills, sending stamps home so his family wouldn't have to spend money on postage. He died not knowing if any of it mattered, if his small acts of love would make any difference. But they had. 100 years later, they'd saved me, not with money. Money was just a mechanism. He'd saved me by teaching me, through Grandma, through those letters, what it meant to take care of people, what it meant to choose the ones you love over the easy path. Dad had failed that test. Linda had failed it completely. They'd chosen money and convenience and ego over family. I'd chosen differently. I'd chosen Sarah. I'd chosen Emily. I'd chosen to build something that mattered instead of just taking what I could get. The wooden box was at home on our bookshelf, empty now but still precious, still the container that had held those letters for 80 years. Sometimes I'd take it down and just hold it, feel the cracked wood, remember the sound it made hitting the driveway, remember Dad's face when he told me to take the trash and leave, remember how close I'd come to losing everything. But I hadn't lost. I'd won, not because of the money, because I'd learned what actually had value. Family isn't about blood. It's about who stays when things get hard, who stands up for you when it costs them something, who values you for yourself, not what you can give them. Sarah was family. Emily was family. Marcus was more family than my own father had been. And somewhere across time and distance and death, my great-grandfather had managed to take care of his family, had managed to send help when it was needed most, just like he'd promised in his letters, just like he'd always planned. The restaurant was named Eleanor's, but it could have been named James's, named after the soldier who'd worried about stamps and heating bills, who'd sent love home wrapped in small, practical gestures, who'd saved his family twice, once in 1918 with stamps, So his wife wouldn't spend money on postage. And once in 2024 with those same stamps, selling for millions. Both times, it wasn't about the money. It was about taking care of the people who mattered. That was the real inheritance. The one that actually had value. Everything else was just details.